Going to assume I'm audible. I've got one person tuned in, it looks like. Maybe it's Sunny. Anyways, um, hi everyone. My name is Russ Weninger. I'm an immigration lawyer with Weninger Jong. Uh, Today, this webinar is going to be on common paths to permanent residence. And I'm going to talk about those paths in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And before we get into it, I just want to give a shout out to my articling student, Sunny Liu, who is almost on the verge of becoming a full-fledged lawyer. She's doing an excellent job helping me out with my law practice and with this webinar series. So thank you very much, Sunny. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my viewers, people who are tuned in to watch this webinar. I hope you find it worthwhile. And if you do find it worthwhile, feel free to share these videos and with others and to let them know about this webinar series, because I'm doing it to help people and to make everyone's life a little bit easier. Hopefully, everyone who's got concerns about status, or they're wondering what their future in terms of immigration is, and so I'm hoping to make things better for those sorts of people. And so if you know of someone who might benefit from listening to these webinars, feel free to send them links and to let them know. Okay, it looks like a couple of people are tuned in now, and it looks like the audio seems to be okay, so that's a very good thing. So why don't I get into it? So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to go over today. I'm going to talk about a few updates, and then I'm going to talk about different immigration streams, different paths to permanent residence. So I'm going to discuss express entry. I'm also going to discuss provincial nominee programs. In particular, I'm going to discuss the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. I'm going to talk about spousal and common law partner sponsorship. I'm going to go over humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications, and I'm also going to discuss refugee claims. And then at the end, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take those questions. Or for that matter, if you have questions at any point during the webinar, feel free to type up. I can see if anyone has a question in the chat, and I'll be sure to answer that. So, or I'll do my best to answer that, if depending on how many questions I get. So if you have a burning question, and I see there are only 2 people at this point streaming, so hopefully we'll get more viewers joining us later on. But maybe it's almost like a personal consultation. If you happen to be watching and you have a bunch of burning questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. So feel free to pipe up. Try not to, if you do have questions, try not to make them too personal. So don't go into too many personal details, or don't give any details that might identify you. Because this is a public forum, this is going on YouTube. It's not just a private in the office consultation, or a private consultation that I would do over Skype. This is public. The other thing I should note is if you do have any questions, keep in mind, nothing I'm doing today constitutes providing legal advice, because to properly give legal advice, I have to be meeting with a client either in person or over Skype or something like that. But I have to get a fair bit of context from a client before I can properly advise them. And so the quick and dirty answers that I might be giving you today, take those with a grain of salt. It's always better to have a chat with a lawyer to really dig into what your circumstances are, and to come up with a, a solution that's tailored to those particular circumstances. Uh, so uh, so yeah, don't take anything I say today as being legal advice. Um, Before we uh, get into it with some updates and things like that, I should tell you a little bit about myself. So, my name's, as I mentioned earlier, my name's Russ Weninger. I'm originally from Pincher Creek, Alberta, which is a small town not too far from Waterton National Park. In case anyone's been to Waterton Park, it's a beautiful park. It's I think one of the most underrated national parks in Canada. It's kind of like a mini Banff, but I think it's in a lot of respects nicer than Banff. But it doesn't get a lot of traffic because it's not as close to Calgary, and it's smaller, and it's a little bit windier maybe, and so yeah, a little bit further away from Calgary. Weather's not always as nice, and so it doesn't really get the traffic it probably deserves, but it's a beautiful park, and so if you get a chance, go to Waterton sometime. It's really nice. So yeah, I grew up near Waterton in the town of Pincher Creek. Um, I unfortunately didn't get the opportunity to really learn French as a child. My brother and sister both went to a French immersion program in Pincher Creek, but that program started late, so I wasn't able to participate in that. And so, even though Canada is a bilingual country and we have two official languages, and ideally everyone should learn French as well as English. I didn't really get that opportunity. I did a little bit of high school French, but yeah, regrettably, I'm unilingual, or practically speaking unilingual, but my siblings are actually bilingual, fluent in French and English. And when I graduated from high school, I went and I did a philosophy degree at the University of Lethbridge. It was actually a combined philosophy and music degree, and then I ended up going to after that to Dalhousie University, and I did a master's degree in philosophy. And when I was done my master's degree, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, and so I took some computer science. I studied computer science for a while. Then I ended up in law school, um, and I'm not one of those people who, since the age of 5, dreamed of being a lawyer or anything like that. I just kind of accidentally ended up in law school, and I've never looked back. I graduated with my law degree, and for going on 13 years, I've been practicing law. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's talk about some updates. So the big update, I think, it doesn't really have to do with a government announcement or anything, but it's something I've noticed with my clients. A lot of my clients have express entry profiles, and they've had those profiles active for some time. So for the last couple of weeks, I've actually had, or over the last week, I should say, I've had some clients reach out to me and let me know that they've actually received an invitation to apply. And these people have been waiting with profiles in the express entry pool for quite some time, several months, maybe some pushing a year at this point. So that's promising. That means that the points required for express entry, especially in the Canadian experience class, they appear to be coming down. So that's a very good sign that for people who are currently in Canada and they have some skilled work experience, and maybe in the past they weren't receiving, they didn't have enough points to receive an invitation to apply under express entry. Maybe opportunities for them in express entry will open up in the very near future. Maybe they'll receive an invitation to apply in the near future. Now, the clients who received invitations to apply, they were kind of in the mid 400s range. So their points weren't super low or anything like that, but they weren't super high either. They were just kind of on the cusp of receiving that invitation, but recently did receive that invitation. So I think that's a promising sign. So express entry seems to be issuing invitations to apply, and to people who don't exactly have low points, but that were lower than for recent express entry draws. Let me put it that way. AINP, on the other hand, we had a client last week that AINP sent out a notice to, and they said, we want to know if this person is still working. And we responded back and said, well, the person, they're due to start working very shortly. They work in a service industry type job, and we can expect them to start working any day now, and the employer has indicated they want to hire them back. So AINP actually paused their application, and advised us that they weren't going to process the application at this point in time because the person wasn't currently working. Even though they were being paid by the employer, they weren't currently working. And they also advised in the letter that they would require the person, when they resumed their work, if they were going to get a nomination, they had to have more than just implied status. So they actually had to have a valid work permit. So that's the other kind of update I wanted to let people be aware of. There was some speculation about whether AINP might relax some of its standards in terms of the requirement to have a current valid work permit. And no, it doesn't appear to be the case that they are relaxing that previous standard at all. It's still their standard. They want anyone who's going to receive a nomination under AINP to have a current valid work permit. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Another thing to report is that the government appears to be taking a more relaxed view about online courses for international students. So there was some concern amongst international students that they might be in programs where now, in the past they were doing in-person classes, but now they're doing online courses, just due to the circumstances that you can't have in-person classes right now. And so people were concerned that this might affect their eligibility for postgraduate work permits down the road, or that this might not count as Canadian education down the road in terms of express entry or something like that. But it appears to be the case. So the government has indicated that they will allow people to take a fairly generous serving of online courses. Currently, because of these circumstances, if it's part of a regular university or college program that would normally be an in-person program, and the government appears to be treating that as, for the time being anyways, as if those classes were in-person classes. So that's a good thing, and it's. Oh, I spilled some coffee. I'm holding. You can't see my hands on the screen, but I'm holding some coffee in my hands, and I just was fiddling with the cup, and I spilled a little bit. I'll take a drink. So yeah, that's a fortunate thing. It appears as if the government is acknowledging the fact that, at least for the time being, international students might have to take online classes rather than in-person classes, and it appears as if that won't affect eligibility for postgraduate work permits down the road. So that's a good thing. So let's jump into Express Entry now and talk a little bit about that. Um, in case people aren't familiar with Express Entry, in case they don't know what it is, Express Entry is usually the first thing I suggest that a client look at, or a prospective client look at, if they tell me they're interested in immigrating to Canada. It's always a good idea to look at Express Entry um, as a potential option for immigration, because it's a fairly quick and easy and efficient process for acquiring permanent residency, provided that you meet the requirements and provided that the application is done right. So you have to be careful when you're doing an Express Entry application. You have to make sure that the information is accurate, and if you're trying to apply under Express Entry, it's very important to make sure that you're that you actually do meet the requirements. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere with the application process. But if you do meet the requirements, it's oftentimes a very good option for people. So what are the requirements? Well, ordinarily for Express Entry, a person needs skilled work experience. So they need at least a year's worth of skilled work experience, and ideally, but not always, but ideally that work experience should be in Canada. Um, so there are a few different federal programs under Express Entry, and there are also some provincial programs under Express Entry. So Express Entry has a program called the uh, Federal Skilled Worker Program. They have another program called the Federal Skilled Trades Program, and they have another program called the Canadian Experience Class. And these are all federal immigration programs. Express Entry also uh, uh, does some processing for provincial nominee programs. So some provinces, Alberta being one of them, actually participate in Express Entry, and they have some of their provincial nominee applicants go through Express Entry rather than going through a paper application submission process. So the thing about Express Entry, it's entirely digital. What you do is you're filling out online forms, and you're submitting an application package through PDF uploads. So you're not actually mailing in paper documents to a government office or anything. You're actually uploading documents to the government, and you're filling out online forms. So that's the way Express Entry happens, or how an Express Entry application happens. The other thing to note about Express Entry is that it's a two-step process. So the first step is to create a profile. And in your profile, you provide a lot of information about yourself, personal information, your age, your marital status, your educational background, your employment history, and you also provide information about your language proficiency, so English or French language proficiency, and this is information that's based on la- language test results. So in the case of English proficiency, a person can either do an exam called the CELPIP, or they can do an exam called the IELTS. And if a person does either of those exams, they'll get a score, and then they can input that score into their express entry profile when they're creating a profile. And then what happens is a computer algorithm uh, will assign them points based on the information they provided in their profile. And uh, those points will determine whether or not they receive an invitation to apply. What you have to do in Express Entry, you not only have to have a certain number of points uh, to receive an invitation to apply, but you also have to meet the criteria of a particular immigration stream. So, for example, the Canadian Experience class requires a person to have 1 year of Canadian skilled work experience in order to qualify. Um, so, so in order to get an invitation to apply under the Canadian Experience class, what you need to do is uh, not only have enough points to receive an invitation to apply under the Canadian or have enough points to receive an invitation to apply under Express Entry, but you have to meet the particular requirements of the Canadian Experience class. And that applies to the other streams as well, the federal skilled worker stream, the federal skilled trade stream, and the provincial nominee streams as well. Now, people oftentimes wonder, okay, so I need to meet the requirements for a particular uh, immigration stream, and I also have to have a certain level of points under Express Entry. What's that level of points? What will get me an invitation to apply under Express Entry? And the answer is it depends. It depends on what the government has decided at that particular time will be the point cutoff. And every couple of weeks or every month that will change. So lately, forgetting the last couple of draws, let's say, but lately, um, the government has been giving draws or issuing point draws that were in the high 400s and above. So in the kind of the 470 range and above, kind of. That was the typical range for Express Entry draws. But lately, the points have gone down to around the mid 400s. So if you have points around the 450 mark or something like that, you might expect maybe even the 440s. It's possible you could receive an invitation to apply at some point in the near future. And it may go lower than that. And in fact, it's always a moving target with Express Entry. So it depends on how many people are currently sitting in the Express Entry pool, how many people currently have profiles. And if there are a lot of people with very high points sitting in the Express Entry pool, then the point draws are going to tend to be higher. But if most of the people who can be drawn through Express Entry have lower points, then the point draws are going to tend to be lower. Now, what sort of characteristics does a person need to be a good candidate for Express Entry? That's another important question to ask. As a rule of thumb, the better educated you are, the higher your language proficiency in English and or French. The younger you are, the more skilled work experience you have, and the more connections to Canada you have, the better your chances of receiving an invitation to apply under express entry. So, for example, if you're perfectly fluent in English, you will get higher points than if your English is only mediocre. If you have a PhD, you'll get more points than if you just have a 2-year diploma. If you have 5 years of skilled work experience, that's better than if you just have 1 year of skilled work experience. And if you have an education in Canada, or some of your education's in Canada, um, or you have Canadian work experience, that's better than if you don't have any Canadian work experience or Canadian education. And in terms of age, if you're in your 20s or early 30s, that's better than if you're in your late 30s or 40s. And once you hit the age of 45, and I'm already past that age, you don't get any points under express entry for age. So older applicants tend to be a little bit disadvantaged by express entry. Older applicants really, to be competitive under express entry, they have to have very good English or French, and they have to have a significant degree of skilled work experience, and they usually have to have a high level of education, so something like a master's degree maybe. So yeah, the older you get, the better the higher your education and the more work experience, and the better your English should be. And so express entry may be an option for you, but it's quite competitive. You're basically being ranked against other applicants, and so it's almost like a university application process. The goal is to get the best and brightest people, and the people who will be kind of active in the Canadian workforce for the longest period of time. So yeah, it's awesome if a person qualifies under express entry, and awesome if they have the points under express entry to receive an invitation to apply. But for some people, that may not be practically possible. Now, that being said, I think anyone who's serious about immigrating to Canada should at the very least look at express entry and see how far they are away from meeting the requirements under express entry. Because in some cases, a person might not currently qualify under express entry. They might not currently have the points necessary, or they might currently not meet the requirements for one of the immigration streams under express entry. But if they do something, like let's say they improve their English score by working with an English coach or something like that, or they go back and do another year of post-secondary education, or they go back and work in a skilled occupation for another year or something like that, then maybe they will qualify under express entry. So it's always worth checking out the requirements for express entry to see if those requirements are anywhere close to being met by you currently. So express entry would be something I'd recommend that people look into. And one way to check to see if you might be a good candidate for express entry is to go to, it's called the Comprehensive Ranking System tool. So if you're applying under express entry, or thinking about applying under express entry, I think the first thing I'd recommend doing is going to that Comprehensive Ranking System tool and kind of guesstimating your points. And you might have to make some educated guesses, because some things it'll ask you are, whether or not you've completed an educational credential assessment for any education outside of Canada, and whether or not you've done an IELTS exam or a CELPIP exam, some English proficiency exam. And if you haven't done those things, you probably guess what your score might be on an IELTS exam, guess what your educational credential assessment result might be for any education completed outside of Canada, and and you make those guesses for the purpose of working through the comprehensive ranking system tool, and then when you get some points from that tool, you can use that to decide whether or not express entry might be right for you, and whether or not it's even worth taking the IELTS and getting your educational credentials assessed and creating an express entry profile. So that would be something I'd recommend looking into if you're thinking about immigrating to Canada. I definitely recommend checking out express entry. Another thing about express entry is if you're currently, this ties into what I'm next going to talk about, which is the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. But if you, let's say you meet the requirements for one of the immigration streams under express entry. Let's say you meet the requirements for the Canadian Experience class, but your points are quite low. Your points are, I shouldn't say quite low, but low relative to them being normally competitive under express entry. So your points are in the 300 range rather than in the mid to high 400 range. Well, if you're currently living and working in Alberta and you currently have a valid work permit in Alberta, you might receive an invitation to apply through provincial nomination. So the Alberta government may in fact reach out to you and say, look, we noticed that you've got over 300 points in your express entry profile, and we think you might meet the requirements of the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program express entry stream. So why don't you apply under that extreme? And then what you can do is you can submit your application for nomination to the province. And if you get nominated under the express entry AINP stream, then you'll get an extra 600 points. So even though you're starting off with 300 points, let's say, if you get that nomination from the provincial government, then you'll have another 600 points, so you'll be at 900 points, and that'll be more than enough to get an invitation to apply under express entry. So even if you think you might not be competitive in terms of points under express entry, it's oftentimes worth creating that express entry profile. As long as you meet the basic requirements of one of the express entry federal streams, such as the Canadian Experience class stream. Because if you meet those basic requirements and you're currently working in Alberta under a valid work permit, you might actually be able to get nominated through Alberta's express entry stream. So keep that in mind. Now, if you let's say express entry isn't right for you, or your points just aren't high enough, or you don't have skilled work experience, or you don't have the requisite level of language ability, what you can do then is submit, or what you can potentially do is submit a paper application under AINP. So AINP, the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, that allows a person to apply in Alberta for nomination for permanent residence, and it allows them to apply even though they might not, let's say, otherwise be good candidates for immigration. So maybe they don't, or at least under the federal immigration program, so they don't necessarily have super high levels of English language proficiency. They don't necessarily have super high levels of education or skilled work experience or anything like that. Maybe they don't even have any skilled work experience at all, but they've got um, some work experience in uh, something like retail or fast food, or some type of semi-skilled service industry type job. Um, Oftentimes those people are good candidates for nomination under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. Now, the thing to note, there are a few things to note about the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program is, and like one of the big things to note about that program is that it takes a while to meet the requirements for the program. So you typically have to have a certain level of Alberta work experience. In most cases, that's at least a year of Alberta work experience. And so you need Alberta work experience. You need current valid status as a worker, as a work permit holder, um, in order to get a nomination under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. So you have to basically be living and working in Alberta, and you have to have that historical Alberta work experience in order to qualify. So you need a bit of time. A 1 year work permit might not cut it for getting nomination under AINP, because yes, you'll get a year of Alberta work experience under your belt, but then when you go to apply for nomination, your work permit will already have expired. So usually people who are in a good position to apply under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program are people who have work permits that are longer than 1 year, so 2 years, 3 years, something like that. So LMIA-based work permits that are 2 years in length, those oftentimes are good for AINP applicants. Postgraduate work permits that are at least 2 years in length or 3 years in length, those are oftentimes good for AINP applicants. Sometimes people who come on working holidays in International Experience Canada type work permits, if they can either get multiple work permits or get a work permit that's at least 2 years in length, they can sometimes use that to get enough work experience to qualify for nomination under AINP. So yeah, for AINP you should have a work permit that's of significant duration to qualify. Where sometimes people make mistakes is they bounce around from job to job, and they don't pick up enough work experience in a particular occupation for a particular employer, and that sometimes does them in. So when you get if you're interested in immigrating to Canada, it's not just about getting a job that you're totally in love with and finding an employer that you are totally in love with or something like that. You want to get something that's going to help you immigrate to Canada. And so if you find a job that is going to lead to possibly provincial nomination down the road, it's a good idea to, if AINP is your only viable option, it's a good idea to stick with that job. Um, so, uh, especially for working holiday type people, oftentimes, because they're open work permits and they have a fair bit of mobility, oftentimes they bounce around from job to job, and then next thing you know, 2 years goes by, and uh, they're not at the point where they can, receive a nomination under AINP because they don't have that consistent work experience in a particular occupation. But if they had just maybe stayed with one job, they would have qualified. So that's something to keep in mind. When you come to Canada, when you're working on a working holiday work permit, or any type of work permit for that matter, what you want to do is think about how you can use that work experience under that work permit to get you permanent residence. And if that work experience, even if it's not the most wonderful job in the world, if it will lead to permanent residence down the road, it may be the case that you should just stick with that particular job with that particular employer, um, up till the point that you qualify for permanent residence, or at least until you get nomination under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, and then once you've satisfied the immigration requirements, then you may want to look at moving on to greener pastures and in other occupations with other employers. With AIMP, a person does need to have kind of good, solid, intermediate English or French proficiency. They don't. A person doesn't have to be super fluent, but they have to be reasonably fluent. So you do still require IELTS or CELPIP test scores if you're applying under AINP, or French language test scores as well. Those can be used. And your education, I think the requirement for AINP is the equivalent of, at least the equivalent of, Canadian high school, which means that people from some countries, even if they graduated from high school in those countries, they may not actually meet the requirements for AINP. So, for example, in the Philippines, high school tends to only go up to grade 10, or at least historically that was the case. High school would only go up to grade 10. So if you come from the Philippines and you don't have, let's say, a university degree, you only have a high school diploma. Maybe you've done 1 or 2 years of university or college, but you didn't actually finish a post-secondary credential. You might not have the equivalent of high school education in Canada as far as AINP is concerned. So that's something to keep in mind, that a person needs to have the equivalent of Canadian high school to qualify under AINP. And yeah, they need basic language proficiency, and they need some level of work experience in Alberta, and they need to be able to maintain valid worker status under a work permit, not just under implied status, but under a work permit, until they receive nomination. Now, the other thing about AINP, and this applies to all provincial nominee programs actually, is that you have to have an intention to reside in the province. Now, that doesn't mean you're committing to living for the rest of your life in a province or anything like that, but you do have to show that you are going to at least at least for the next little while, be living in that province. And so if a person moves to another province while either prior to nomination or even after nomination, but before they get permanent residence, if they move to another province or take another job in another province, uh, they're they're basically making themselves ineligible for permanent residence under that particular provincial nominee program. So that's something to keep in mind. You're if you're applying under a provincial nominee program, you're essentially committing yourself to live in that province and to work in that province until you get permanent residence. And sometimes people make the mistake when they're applying through a provincial nominee program. When they go to do the landing interview, sometimes they go and do the landing interview in another province, either at a port of entry in another province or at a CIC office in another province. And if they do that, the officer may end up rejecting the application because it appears on the face of it as if the person isn't living in the province that nominated them. So if you want to apply under AINP, you should be committed to living in Alberta for the foreseeable future, and that's probably at least a couple of years, because it oftentimes takes a few months, sometimes longer, to receive an AINP nomination. And then when you receive that nomination, you have to apply within 6 months to IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. You have to apply for permanent residence. And at the IRCC level, at the federal level, it oftentimes takes somewhere between 18 months and 2 years to actually process the provincial nominee application at the federal level. So practically speaking, what that means is that you're going to have to be, if you submit the application for AINP today, you're probably going to be stuck in Alberta for at least the next 2 years. And so if that's okay, if you're fine with being in this particular province for the next 2 years, then an AINP application might be right for you. But if you're looking at moving to BC or to Ontario or something like that, then you should look at other options. Maybe you should look at provincial nominee programs in those provinces, or you should look at federal options. But AINP might not be right for you. Okay, so I've talked about express entry. I've talked about AINP. Let me talk about spousal sponsorship a bit and common law partner sponsorship. Now, sometimes people might not even realize that they're common law partners and could be sponsored. So in order to qualify as a sponsored spouse, you have to be, or as a sponsored common law partner, I should say, you have to be in a relationship with a Canadian or a permanent resident who's also living in Canada, and intending to reside in Canada, and you have to have been in a relationship with that person for at least a year, and that relationship has to have been one of cohabitation. So you were living together, and you were living together as a couple. So you weren't just roommates, but you're actually in a relationship. So for common law partner status, to qualify as someone who can be sponsored as a common law partner, you have to have that Canadian or permanent resident partner that you've been living with for at least a year. And you don't necessarily have to have been living with that person in Canada for at least a year, but you have to have been living with that person somewhere for at least a year, and then at the time that your application is submitted, you have to demonstrate that there's an intention. You're either currently living in Canada or there's an intention to reside in Canada. Not only for you, but for you, for your sponsor. So If you have, for example, a Canadian citizen common law partner who is living and working overseas and they never plan on coming back to Canada, you're not going to be eligible to be sponsored uh, under spousal or common law partner sponsorship. Your partner or your spouse who's Canadian, they have to have an intention to reside in Canada. Um, now, uh, so for common law partners, you have to be living together for at least a year. For spouses, you have to be legally married. So that's the distinction there. And sometimes people ask, well, which is better, marriage or common law in terms of the application? And it entirely depends. It depends on whether you can satisfy the requirements for either one. It's potentially quicker to get married, but sometimes people can't legally marry. So, for example, let's say you were previously married in the Philippines. That's a country that doesn't recognize divorces. So there's a good chance that you have not been able to get a divorce from your spouse, who's your estranged spouse, who's from the Philippines, and maybe the only thing you can do is qualify as a common law partner because you can't legally marry. You can't legally marry someone else because you're currently married. So sometimes the common law partner route is the only route because marriage just isn't an option. In other cases, marriage is a better option because living common law for a year is not practical. It would cost too much money for the spouse to just be sitting at home doing nothing while they wait for a year to qualify for sponsorship, for example. So sometimes getting married is the better option than living common law. So it depends on the circumstances. Now, aside from spousal sponsorship, I should mention that that simply being married to someone, whether or not that person is a Canadian or a permanent resident or even a foreign national, a foreign worker or something like that. If you're in a relationship with someone, and let's say they're a skilled foreign worker, that might lead to permanent residence as well. If a person is applying for permanent resident as a skilled worker under express entry or AINP or whatever, they can also include their spouse or common law partner on their application for permanent residence. Now that's different. Sometimes people think of that as sponsorship, but that's not actually sponsorship. So when a person qualifies for permanent residence that way as the spouse or common law partner of a skilled worker or someone who qualifies under AINP or express entry, they're not actually being sponsored for permanent residence. They're acquiring permanent residence as the accompanying dependent of an applicant for permanent residence. So it's kind of a subtle distinction, but it's an important distinction, and so it's important to note that in some cases a person can acquire permanent residence through marriage or through a common law relationship, but that person might not necessarily even be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. They might be someone who themselves will qualify for permanent residence through an immigration stream. Now I should talk briefly about humanitarian compassionate grounds applications. I chatted about those applications in a previous webinar, but I should mention agency applications again, because when all else fails, sometimes an agency application is your only recourse. So an agency application is an application that you can submit if you have some compelling reason to remain in Canada and to qualify for permanent residence, but you you don't otherwise meet the requirements for an immigration program. So maybe you don't have the language ability or the skilled work experience or the level of work experience at all to qualify either under AINP or Express Entry or something like that. But nonetheless, you have and you're not maybe eligible for spousal sponsorship or common law partners sponsorship, but nonetheless, you have a compelling reason to stay in Canada as a permanent resident. So, uh, yeah, the humanitarian compassionate grounds application can, in some cases, be an application that can be used uh, even if you don't meet the requirements for any other immigration stream. The thing to note with a humanitarian application is it's considered an exceptional or an extraordinary remedy. At least it is by many immigration officers and many federal court justices. So when you're doing a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application, what you want to do is convince the immigration officer that there's something special about your application, that you're not just some person who wants to immigrate to Canada and you otherwise don't meet the requirements, so you're submitting a humanitarian application. With an H&C application, you want to be showing that you would face some significant hardship if you were to return to your home country. Ideally, what you want to be showing is that this hardship would affect you to a greater degree than it might affect the average person in your country, for example. So you want to show that you would face some hardship if you were required to leave Canada. You ideally want to show that you're established in Canada, so that you have been working here, that you've been paying taxes, that you've been, contributing to Canadian society in some way, that you've made friends here, that maybe you have family here. So you want to show some degree of establishment in Canada. And you also, ideally, if it's applicable, you want to show that the best interests of a child will be positively affected by you acquiring permanent residence or by you being allowed to stay in Canada. So if you can show those three things, if you can show that you would face hardship if you were required to return to your home country, that you are established in Canada, and maybe that a child would be positively affected, and a child in this case is someone under the age of 18 years of age. So if you can show that, then you might have a shot at qualifying under humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So that's something to think about. Just very briefly, I'm going to talk about refugee claims. Refugee claims, I've had a lot of interest from people lately in refugee claims, but most people simply won't qualify. So I want to make that clear. One thing about a refugee claim, now there is a process for sponsoring overseas refugees, but it's very difficult, and you have to meet a lot of requirements. So it's almost like winning the lottery to be sponsored as an overseas refugee. So in the vast majority of cases, to qualify as a refugee, you have to currently be in Canada, and you have to make a refugee claim in Canada. So to get here to make a claim, you're typically going to need a visa, or you're going to need an electronic travel authorization, but you're going to have to, first of all, get to Canada, have some way of actually setting foot in Canada, even if it's just at the border, in order to qualify to make a refugee claim. Now, just because you make a refugee claim doesn't mean you're going to succeed in your refugee claim. It's a very common misconception that Canada lets everyone in who applies as a refugee, and that they buy every story that a person puts forward about being a refugee. That all you have to do is, you know, say you're persecuted and cry a few tears, and that they'll give you permanent residence as a refugee. It's not that easy. I've done refugee claims before for clients. It's a difficult process, and the Refugee Protection Division, when they do a refugee hearing, the a member of the Refugee Protection Division, who's like an immigration judge basically, or a refugee judge, they will put a claimant they will basically put them on the hot seat and ask them a lot of very challenging questions about their background, about why they came to Canada, about what it is they fear in their home country, whether they could have gone to the authorities in their home country for protection, whether they could have moved somewhere else in their home country, whether they were really in danger in their home country, or whether it was just more a case of mild discrimination. So refugee claims are appropriate for, if your life is in danger, if you have to return to your home country, and it's in danger not due to kind of a lack of medical resources in your home country, or due to something of that nature, but it's due to some sort of malevolent force in your home country, the government acting malevolently towards you, or criminals or some organized crime group acting malevolently towards you. If you're not facing that sort of malevolent danger, if you were to return to your home country, a refugee claim isn't really right for you. So you need to establish that you're going to face persecution from someone, and that persecution is at a certain level that goes past kind of discrimination, let's say. There are plenty of places in the world where all sorts of people might face certain types of discrimination, but that doesn't necessarily warrant a refugee claim. You really have to show that there's some sort of significant danger to your life or to your well-being if you're returning to your home country. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's not just that you're in danger in some particular part of your home country, but that you would be in danger everywhere in your home country. So this is another area where refugee claims sometimes fall apart. Is someone will say, well, I encountered some criminals in my hometown when I was living back in my home country, but maybe that home country is, it spans thousands of miles, and there are all sorts of different places where a person could move in their home country and be perfectly safe. And sometimes people think they can just kind of BS their way through that and say, oh, well, this organization, they're going to track me everywhere in the country. If they have evidence of that, then that's fine. Then they can address that concern. But if it's just their say so that this criminal organization is going to track them throughout the country, if they return, if it's just their say so, and the Refugee Protection Division members' own evidence based on credible country condition information that they have access to. If their own evidence is that there are safe places where a person could potentially go in that person's country, then a person's going to have a tough go of it in a refugee claim. So bottom line, refugee claims are sometimes appropriate, especially if a person is objectively facing persecution, or their life is in danger if they have to return to their home country. So there are definitely cases where refugee claims are absolutely appropriate, but they're not right for everyone, and a refugee claim shouldn't just be considered a quote-unquote easy way to get permanent residence, because it's not. It's actually quite a difficult way in most cases to get permanent residence, and it's an all-or-nothing strategy. So if you submit a refugee claim but that claim is rejected, the government's actually going to take steps to remove you from Canada. So that's something to keep in mind with these other immigration programs. If you get a rejection, that doesn't necessarily affect your temporary status in Canada. So for example, if you apply under express entry and you get a rejection on your express entry application, or on your AINP application, or on your spousal sponsorship application, if you otherwise have valid temporary status in Canada, say status as a worker or something like that, you can potentially remain in Canada. But if you make a refugee claim and that claim gets rejected, the government's going to eventually want you to leave Canada. And in some cases, they give you a fair bit of time to make another type of application, maybe a humanitarian application, or something along those lines, or spousal sponsorship. In another case, they very quickly escort you out of the country. At this point, currently the government isn't engaging in removals. At least I believe the removals are still on hold. I might be wrong on that, but that's my understanding, that currently removals have been suspended for people who have removal orders issued against them. But that could change in the near future, with COVID-19 restrictions easing in many provinces. At any point the government could just decide, okay, we're going to resume removals of failed refugee claimants and people like that. And so I wouldn't recommend basing your permanent residence strategy on a refugee claim unless you are a bona fide refugee. So hopefully that makes sense. So I've gone a little bit over the hour. I should check to see if anyone has any questions at this point. It doesn't really look like anyone does. I'll maybe just stay on for another minute or so, just to see if anyone has some burning question they want to ask me about any of this. If you do, now is the time to ask. I'm kind of a captive audience here. Is there a high chance that AINP will revoke the old nomination due to the nominee's employment condition changing from full to part-time due to COVID-19? And that was asked by Mototo Kino. And that's a very good question. At this point, I suspect that won't happen in most cases. I had something similar happen to a client recently, where the nomination was actually revoked at the federal stage of processing. So the person already had this person reach out to me, and they the story they told me was that they already had nomination from the province, and then they applied for permanent residence at the federal level, and but AINP found out that they weren't working full time for the employer, and they actually uh, revoked the nomination, even though it was already at the federal stage of processing. Um, in that particular case, that part time that move to part-time work that happened prior to the pandemic. So that happened prior to COVID-19 coming to Canada. So I don't know how AINP is going to react to nominees who currently have applications being processed who might have moved to part-time employment due to the pandemic. That's a very good question. I suspect they're not going to go out of their way to revoke those nominations, or to look into whether those people are still working full time. But I can't say for certain. I don't know. One experience I've had with AINP over the years, and this, I'm not sure this is fair. I don't know if other people have necessarily had the same experience that I've had, but the experience I've had is that AINP tends to be very by the book. They're not overly empathetic towards their applicants. They're not overly compassionate towards their applicants. That's the feeling I get interacting with the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. Historically, they haven't charged anything for AINP applications, and that might explain part of the difference, why they're not overly sympathetic to their applicants, and why they're very by the book. But in the future, at least with certain types of AINP applications, they're going to start charging fees, and maybe that will, create a higher level of customer service, possibly. I don't know, but AINP, as a rule, they tend to be kind of not very accommodating. Let me put it that way. And yeah, in some cases, I think they maybe even go out of their way to cause problems for certain types of applicants. So yeah, how will AINP respond in this particular case? I'm hoping they won't be jerks. I'm hoping they'll be sympathetic to the plight of people who are now working part-time simply because of the pandemic, not due to the fact that they're irresponsible people who have just decided to work fewer hours or something like that. Not that that's irresponsible, but it's if you're applying for permanent residence under one of those economic streams, typically there's the expectation that you will maintain your employment, and that you will have a degree of financial stability and security, and demonstrate an ability to support yourself if you acquire permanent residence. So ordinarily, there is that expectation of maintaining employment. Under these circumstances, given the kind of once in a lifetime nature of this situation, hopefully AINP will cut people some slack, but I don't really know. Does anyone else have any questions? No, I don't see any other questions. But thanks so much to everyone for tuning in today. Sorry about the audio, the technical difficulties earlier. I'll be posting this online. So if you happen to miss part of this webinar, you had to leave for a bit to do something else, and you missed something but want to come back to it, it'll be available online on YouTube. And I'll be doing more of these webinars. I plan to do them every week. There may be some weeks that I can't do them, but I'm going to try to consistently, as consistently as possible, keep doing these on Wednesday mornings. So same time, same place next week. If you want to tune in, you can hear more of what I have to say and ask more questions if you have any questions. If there's anything you would like to discuss, if there's any information that might be helpful to you, feel free to reach out to me, or feel free to leave that in the comment section of this video or any other videos that deal with immigration topics on the Wenningerjong YouTube channel. And I'll be happy to address those issues. So you let me know what's important for you to know, and I'll try to produce content that provides that information to you. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. I'm doing this for you, so I'm hoping it's beneficial to you, and I very much appreciate the fact that some people are tuning in and getting benefit out of this. So thank you very much for participating in this as a viewer. And I should once again thank my student, Sunny Lou, for assisting me with this webinar series, and also for assisting me with my immigration practice, so that I can spend as much time as I do preparing content for this webinar series. So thank you very much, Sunny. And I'll see you all hopefully next week. Thank you. Goodbye.